Always good to be with you. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. I read a story the other day of a lady who showed up as a first-time visitor to a church. And she walked up to the front steps, and there was a man serving as kind of usher. And he welcomed her to worship, and he walked her up the steps and to the back of the worship center and said, "Where would you like to sit?" And she said, "I'd like to sit on the front row, please." And he said, "I'm not sure you want to do that. Our pastor's pretty boring." And the woman said, "Do you know who I am?" He said, "No, I don't." She said, "I'm the pastor's mother." He said, "Do you know who I am?" She said, "No." He said, "That's good." So I'm here today with my wife. So be careful what you say to whom. Always good to be with you. Thank you so much. But today's, I think, maybe a little bit of a challenge. We're here a few hours after we lost an hour's sleep, but we're here just a few hours before one of the big events on television every year. The Oscars are tonight, and so we're kind of stuck in between two big events. And number one, I hope we can stay awake. Hope we can stay awake, and hope we can remember a message. Because our message today is about the fact that sometimes we come together to worship, and we bring our very best selves to worship. And sometimes we kind of drag into worship, and we bring our wounded selves. And sometimes when we come to worship, we bring our struggling selves, not sure if we should be there or not. And sometimes we come seeking some relief from the shame we feel for recent events, for those things we've said or done, for forgiveness, as Kenny mentioned. Today, my hope is we can stay awake. My hope is we can drop whatever guilt we felt and whatever shame we think we carry and come into the presence of God and find His presence, find His grace, find the gift of forgiveness. Drop our defenses. Trust that God is in this place. God is in us, and God is in all of us as we gather together. One of the ways for me, one of the places I think I find the greatest blessings in my faith is when we deal with both joy and trouble. Because we do live in the middle of all of these things, don't we? Both joy and trouble. And we can read in our Bible and say, well, Christians are supposed to be joyful people. And Jesus teaches us joy can characterize our life in spite of circumstances. The night before He died, He said, "I say these things while I'm still in the world, so they may have the full measure of my joy within them." As He talks to God and says, "God, I want these followers to experience all the joy I have." And yet, just a chapter before, He said, "I'm going to go away, but I'm going to see you again, and you're going to rejoice, and no one will take away your joy." No joy gets left. Well, that's what we want, isn't it? That's what we're looking for. A place where there's no shame, but nobody can take our joy away. And these are amazing because Jesus has also told them, you're going to be persecuted. Your property is going to be seized. Some of you may be put to death. So how do we reconcile having full joy and having trouble in the world. I'm often disappointed with myself because the events and circumstances of life affect me. They make me sad. They take away my joy, at least for a little while. And maybe you had the same experience. And maybe we can find some words of insight and encouragement from one of those great texts of the New Testament, Romans chapter 8, beginning with verse 28 through verse 30, because this is a text about living in a broken world. And the Apostle Paul, as a follower of Jesus, he was acquainted with all the trouble he's going to talk about. But there are three things he says in these short verses that are helpful to me. Number one, whatever bad things we're experiencing are going to turn out for good. Number two, the good things we experience cannot be lost. And number three, the best things are still to come. So, here's where he starts. Bad things turn out for good. Here's what he says. We know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him. It's important. It's easy, I think. Important for us to remember that it's easy for us to kind of rush past an important truth, and that is followers of Jesus are going to experience the same life circumstances as everybody else. All things are going to happen to Christians. It's important. If we're going to find joy that's impervious to being destroyed or taken. I've lived long enough, and most of you have too, to know that terrible things sometimes happen to people who love God. They do, don't they? But there are some Christians who believe, and some who teach, that if we love God, if we serve God, we won't experience bad things. These are the people who are like the friends of the Old Testament man Job, who said, Job, you've got a lot of trouble. You must be doing something secretly that's really, really bad. So it's time for you to fess up, Job. But loving God, serving God, does not immunize us against bad things. Christians are not like the teacher's pet in the world. You remember that expression, teacher's pet, from grade school? This is a person who gets away with stuff because the teacher likes them. We're not the teacher's pets. But Paul writes and says, who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Okay, that's a great question. Shall trouble or hardship or persecution or famine or nakedness or danger or sword? And all those things had happened to Paul, and he's saying all of them are going to happen to some of you. But then he says something else in this text. When things work out together in our life to produce good, it's because of God. Again, look, we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him. He doesn't say, relax, things work out for the best. He says, God works for the good. God's making the good things happen. All the good things in the world come from him. And Paul's written about the world. He says it's a place that's kind of heavy with evil and guilt and subject to decay. And we see it, don't we? We see it around us. Some of us see it happening in our own bodies. Things fall apart. They hardly ever fall together. The principle of entropy in our universe is things that are left alone deteriorate, don't they? And Paul's saying to Christian people, get rid of this false kind of sentimental idea that in your life, because you love Jesus, everything ought to go right, and that things will always go right, and that's the norm, is for everything to always work right. I think we live in a culture that seems to teach us that if things don't go right for me, I've been defrauded. I should find somebody to sue. Things are supposed to work good. Things are supposed to be easy for me. But I know faithful followers of Jesus who've experienced terrible loss. And Paul says, when things are working out, it's because God's working them out. Everything that goes well is a miracle of His grace. And we, as followers, learn to say thank you. And then he tells us another thing at the beginning of this great text. He says, God makes bad things come out good. We know that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him. He doesn't promise that those who love God are going to have better life circumstances. And it doesn't tell us that you're not seeing the world right if you think these are bad things. They're not really bad things. They're just good things in disguise. That's not what He's saying to us. Remember the story of Jesus and his good friend Lazarus. I think it helps us understand. Lazarus, Jesus' friend, got ill. His sisters called for Jesus, said, please come. Lazarus suffered. Lazarus died. His sisters suffered. And Jesus shared their grief. The shortest verse in the Bible says, Jesus wept. John says he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled when he got to Lazarus' grave. There's this intense upsurge of emotion. It can describe anger and indignation and agitation, deep sorrow. But the truth is, Lazarus' suffering and his sister's suffering triggered Jesus' tears. He bursts into tears. You see, God doesn't have this flippant, callous view of suffering. Jesus knows death's a bad thing. But He was able to turn Lazarus' death into a good thing. It was still bad, but He was able to turn it into a good thing. God hates the pain. He hates the suffering. He hates the alienation. He hates the loneliness that death brings. He hates it for us. So much so that He came to our world and He lived our life and He died our death to destroy those things without destroying us. And remember, Paul says here, all things. That makes it harder to swallow, doesn't it? Not all things? Yeah, all things. The things that have happened, the things that haven't happened yet. All things. So the second great truth he teaches us is the good things can never be lost. Romans 8:28 is a famous verse. It's one of those verses that we Christians like to quote to each other and even to ourselves to make us feel better about our troubles. Sometimes people use this verse to say that if circumstances seem to be bad, God has something better in mind. I'm not sure that's His promise. But here's what He says. We know that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him, who've been called according to His purpose. For those God foreknew, He also predestined to be conformed to the image of His Son. So He explains His purpose. Verse 29 is connected to verse 28 here. God promises to make good things happen in the lives of people who love Him. He doesn't promise constantly pleasant circumstances, but He promises that we will have a good life. Here in this text, Paul uses a word that has become for some people troublesome. He uses the word predestined. And in the minds of some people, it's like Paul used that word to introduce the doctrine of predestination so that the students of John Calvin could argue about it, because Christians have been arguing about it for centuries now. But what it is a statement of comfort. Something that's predestined is fixed. It's going to happen. You can bank on it. God said it's going to happen. It's going to happen. We can depend on that promise. And he predestined us. But what did he predestine us to? To be conformed to the image of his Son. That's what we're predestined to. God intends, even through trouble, even through suffering, even through discomfort, God intends to change Howard Bryan so that his nature matches the nature of Jesus. And that's a big change. That's a long gap. Jesus came and suffered, but he didn't come and suffer so I don't have to suffer. He came to suffer so that through suffering I can become like him. I'm predestined to be conformed to his image. So are you. And so much is God committed to conforming us to the image of Jesus that he changes our relationship to him. Again, our text. For those God foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, that he might be the firstborn among many brothers and sisters. And those he predestined, he also called, and those he called, he also justified, and those he justified, he also glorified. God has been working, predestining me and you. He has called us, he has justified us, he has sanctified us, glorified us. And that means nothing can take that away. Nothing can alter that trajectory of our life, as Kenny mentioned. God has got us on a path to be conformed to the image of Jesus. And the third great truth, the best things are still to come. Those he predestined, he also called. Those he called, he also justified. Those he justified, he also glorified. And I think much of the time we read this text and we think it's saying he will glorify us. But that's not what he says. He uses a past tense verb. Paul's so certain that we're bound together with Jesus that it's a foregone conclusion that every single one of us is going to be as glorious, as beautiful, as perfect as Jesus. It's as good as done. And that's one of the reasons God's people can find joy in the middle of trouble, because we know what God's doing. We know what he's up to. He's not trivializing our suffering. In fact, I think Christianity's the only worldview that legitimately takes suffering seriously, because God takes it seriously. But he sees past it, and he knows he can use suffering to mold us, shape us more like Jesus. I think one of the most amazing aspects of Christianity is the simple truth that our God, when his children are going through suffering, chooses to suffer with us rather than to remove us from the suffering. We're never alone, even in suffering. For me, it's a great text. For me, it gives me comfort. It gives me strength. It helps me find perspective. I hope it does for you too. I love the modern Christian writer who says, when Jesus has returned and he's taken his followers, all of us, to stand before God, that the angels of heaven might very well look at all of us and look at each other and say, which one is Jesus? They all look alike. That's what God's up to. That's what he's doing. Nobody can change it. Nobody can take it. For me, a great blessing. And now, we invite you to the Lord's table. As we prepare for communion today, I want to invite